So I'm going to talk about the past, the present, and the future of UK electricity prices, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Ireland at the end. I claim no particular expertise in the Irish energy system, so it's just going to be a few thoughts. So let me just share my screen. So yeah, let's start with the past of the electricity system. So this is the history of UK electricity bills over the last few decades. The UK electricity system was privatised in the 90s, and we fairly soon after that saw a dash for gas. So we replaced lots of coal-fired power stations with gas-fired ones, and that led to a long reduction in prices, and things were really going extremely well. And of course, then the politicians decided they ought to get involved. So in 2003, we introduced the renewables obligation. So we said to electricity suppliers that they had to sell a certain proportion of renewable electricity. That wasn't the start of renewables. In fact, we had been subsidizing renewables in a small way for some time before that, but this is really where it kicked off. And the result was that prices started to rise. The Climate Change Act came in 2008. That made the drive to renewables a legal obligation. A bit later on, sort of about 2013-14, they closed down the renewables obligation and replaced it with a new subsidy scheme called Contracts for Difference. But the price rises kept continuing until 21-22, when we get the sudden spike, which I'm sure we all know about, but I'll talk about some of the detail of that a little bit later on. The thing to take away from this slide, though, is that we have this long price rise from 2003 to around 2021. Now, what we can say is that that wasn't caused by gas. Here is the gas price data adjusted to real terms. And you can see, if anything, we have a price decline over that period. Okay, so it wasn't gas causing the long price rise. Yes, we had the spike in gas prices there, and that was a contributory factor to the electricity price rises, but it was only part of the story. And again, I'll come to that later. So let's drill into the detail a little bit. So this is a breakdown of a UK electricity bill. This is the median bill, so the typical bill, if you like. This is based on data from Ofgem, which is our energy regulator. Electricity prices, or energy prices, I should say, in the UK are regulated. There is a price cap, which has been around for some time. Ofgem set the price cap, and they provide very detailed data to justify the level at which they're setting it. And it's based on all the component parts of the energy bills, or the energy prices. So that gives us an extremely good understanding of what is driving prices. Now, obviously, the first thing you want to start with when you're analyzing the prices is the wholesale cost. Now, the wholesale cost in the UK is distorted somewhat because we have a carbon tax added on to the price. So the wholesale cost is those first two segments there. It's not just the price of making the electricity, it's also the carbon tax. Now, let's talk a little bit about setting of prices in the wholesale market. Prices in the wholesale market it's relatively well known, I think, now, that they're set by gas-fired power stations. And this has been used as people have said this is why our electricity prices are so high. It's not really true. The way the wholesale market works is this: electricity is a commodity. What is a commodity? A commodities market is where everybody in the market is selling the same thing. And people who can make electricity cheaply don't expect to get a lower price than people who can make it expensively. Okay, and they expect to get at least they expect to get the same price. They're selling the same thing. Now, what used to happen was the people who could bid low prices into the market used to guess what the market clearing price would be, and then they bid that. Now, these days that's been formalized, and we essentially just give everybody the market clearing price at the end of the day. And the result of that new rule change has been that people bid into the market what their actual costs are, because they know as long as they do that, they should get the market clearing price. Now, a word on the market clearing price. What people bid into the market is not their costs. It is their marginal costs, which in the energy system means their fuel costs. Okay? It's their variable costs, if you like. Now, for a wind farm, it has no fuel costs, so it can essentially bid zero into the market. It knows it therefore will be dispatched, it will get to deliver electricity, and it'll get a higher price than that. Nuclear power stations have relatively low fuel costs, so they can bid into the market at a relatively low price too. Gas-fired power stations, however, have quite a lot of fuel costs, and so they will tend to be the most expensive person in the market at any given time. So everybody gets the same price as the gas-fired power station. That's the guts of it. But that's not enough to cover the full costs of the wind farms. Okay, so the wind farms, although they get the higher price of the gas-fired power stations, still need a subsidy because their fixed costs, which is essentially their capital costs and their maintenance costs, are so high. Okay, so the next part of the bill here is the generator subsidies. You can see it's almost as much as the direct cost of making the gas-fired power stations in making electricity in gas-fired power stations. Some of these wind farms are getting more money from subsidy than they are from selling electricity. We have wind farms here that are making 2/3, 3/4 of their money from subsidy. Absolutely sickening if you're a bill payer. So just carrying on around the segments, there are a whole lot of sort of social schemes in this segment for subsidizing poorer consumers, that sort of thing. There's smart meter costs in there, but it's relatively small. The next three segments are what you would call the network costs. So that's the cost of managing the transmission grid, the distribution grid, and the balancing. Okay, the balancing cost is mainly the cost of paying wind farms not to generate. So big scandal comes around every few months in the UK. People get really upset at how much we're paying wind farms not to produce. It's about £2 billion a year. Well, 1 billion goes to the wind farms to switch them off, and another billion goes to a gas-fired power station to supply the electricity to the wind farms customers who weren't going to get their power otherwise. The reason we have to do that is because there is not enough capacity in the wires to get the power to market. A lot of the wind farms are in Scotland. There's not a lot of grid capacity across the Scottish-English border to get the power to the markets in England. So we simply pay the wind farms to switch off. Last segment is the supplier costs. That's kind of can't be argued with, really. It did surge a little bit, as we'll see, during 2022, and I'll talk about that later on. In the next slide, this is showing how bills have changed over the last 10 years. So this is all adjusted to real terms. So this is the bill 10 years ago, £619. And this is the bill today. This is the current price cap, £907. And you can see the reasons for the change. The direct costs, that first dark blue segment of the pie chart we saw in the last slide, this one, that's the direct cost. That hasn't changed at all. Okay, it's exactly the same, nil difference. Most of the increase, something like 200 out of £300, it's policy costs. The color coding here is the same as the last graph. So it's the policy costs that have increased. The network costs have also increased, and the supply costs have gone up a bit. So the argument that is put round all the time that it's something to do with gas is completely untrue. This is the bit that's affected by gas, and it hasn't changed at all. The increases is due to subsidy and network costs in the main. So on we go. Going to drill down a little further into the detail. So this is what's happened to that direct cost since 2015 over the last 10 years. Obviously, the big thing you see here is the spike in direct costs in 2022, caused by the energy price crisis, which, as we know, was caused by Nord Stream. When the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up and gas prices went through the roof. But there were other factors involved. That was actually only one factor in the electricity price spike. Electricity prices also spiked because most of the French nuclear fleet was out for maintenance. Their regulator had said they had to shut down to deal with a particular maintenance issue. I can't even remember what the issue was. Most of the French nuclear fleet was out for this period, and the UK has a huge reliance on French nuclear for when the wind isn't blowing. So essentially, we got into a bidding war over the interconnector for electricity from coal-fired power stations in the Netherlands and things like that. The third factor was also that 2022 was a wind drought year. The wind output of UK wind farms was down something like 20% over the whole year. This happens every so often, and it is a major issue with trying to run a grid on wind power, and it's not talked about enough. We can perhaps talk about that later. So the direct costs, if you look at them in 2015, were just above £200, and if you look at them in 2025, they're just above £200. Essentially, this is why in the previous graph, the change in the direct cost was essentially zero. This is all the other segments. So you can see we have a long, steady increase in the subsidy costs, or the policy costs, if you like, here in green. There's been a little bit of an increase in the network costs, and a little bit of an increase in the other costs, which is essentially the supplier costs. The supplier costs spiked in 2022 because there was a lot of bad debt. So that's really just reinforcing what we saw 2 slides ago in the waterfall chart. Drilling down a little further, we can look at the policy costs in more detail. So starting at the bottom, these are carbon taxes on the on gas-fired power stations. So we put a carbon price on gas-fired power stations for each ton of carbon dioxide they emit. So you can see that's got a long-term upward trend, which is what carbon prices are meant to do. Of course, the economists amongst you will know that if you're putting a carbon price on your gas-fired power stations, you shouldn't be subsidizing your wind farms as well. You do one or the other, but we're doing both because we're daft. Carbon prices again shot up over the energy price crisis. But obviously the big thing here is this second segment, which is the generator subsidies. They've grown and grown and grown. They shrank during the energy price crisis because the contracts for difference, fixed price deals with the wind farms, and when the market price rises above that fixed strike price, the wind farms have to pay back. So here they were paying back, and they paid back £500 million in 2022. Whether any of that went to consumers is another question altogether. There is no formal mechanism for getting that money back to consumers. It may only have gone as far as the suppliers. This one is an interesting one. CM is the capacity market. So this is subsidies to gas-fired power stations to stop them leaving the market. Gas-fired power stations don't get to run very often. So they need subsidy because we need them to stay there in case the wind doesn't blow. This cost, as we'll see, is expected to rise quite sharply. And finally, these are the this last section is the other policy costs, the social schemes. And you can see, again, this is rising pretty steadily. What the politicians are trying to do is to disguise the cost of the system by shuffling costs around the place. So, rich people maybe won't notice if they're paying the bills of the poor people. So there's a lot of sort of transfer of cost. Plus other schemes, of course, like, as I say, things like the smart meters and that sort of thing. Moving on, this is the network costs in more detail. So the transmission, again, is going up. It probably ought to be going up faster than that because we're building a lot of wind farms in places where it's very difficult to get the power to market. And we need more grid quite quickly to get that to enable those wind farms to connect to the system. But I think we simply don't have enough engineers to do it. So that rise has been quite slow. As a result, we're having to pay the wind farms to switch off. So this top section, you can see this is the balancing costs, most of which is paying wind farms to switch off. And that has grown quite considerably in recent years. There is also an element in there of, I said the other side of the balancing is paying a gas-fired power station to switch on to deliver power to the wind farm's customers. And obviously gas prices were quite high there, so it spiked a bit there. But the long-term increase is undeniable. Okay, so that's the history of the thing and sort of takes us up to the present day. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch screens and I'm going to now try to do some stuff on a spreadsheet live. So this is now looking forward and I'm going to need to talk you through these graphs. On what I've done is I've extracted the big costs related to net zero policy. And I've plotted the past and I've modeled the future for those costs. So on this side, in shades of brown, we have essentially all the subsidies. Okay. In shades of blue, we have some of the other important costs. So the balancing costs, the capacity market costs, and the carbon taxes at the top. Okay, that's what that graph is. This graph on the other side is essentially the same numbers, but converted into a price per household. Now, those costs on the left hit the household in two ways. They hit them directly through electricity bills, but a lot of the costs end up on commercial bills and then end up in the general cost of living. So all these attempts to do is to split it between bills and general cost of living, but it also puts everything in prices relative to today. So today's here, 2025. Okay, so you can see in the past, the bills and cost of living were much lower, and in the future, they're going to be much higher. Okay, so let's just talk about what's happening here. We are here on this graph, 2025. We've come off the spike there, and Ed Miliband, our Secretary of State for Energy, is launching a plan called Clean Power 2030, which aims to fully decarbonize the grid in the next 5 years. So To do that, he's going to build a lot of new wind farms. So this is the existing contracts for different subsidies here. This is the renewables obligation subsidies here. But we're going to get a whole lot of new subsidies here for the new wind farms when they come on. That, though, is only one factor. We're now getting to the stage where what you might call the system costs, so this is the blue lines here, these are about to explode. Okay, the balancing costs at the moment are due to there not being enough grid capacity to get the power to market. From now on, though, we're getting a second factor coming into play, which is that from time to time, the whole renewables grid is going to be producing more power than the country needs. So you can't store the power, so we're going to pay them to switch off. So we're going to be paying them to switch off for another reason. So that means these balancing costs are about to explode. National Grid, their worst case scenario says 8 billion those costs could rise to. So there are just over 2 at the moment, so they could quadruple. I'm working on 7 billion here. The capacity market costs are also going to soar because the gas-fired power stations, this is subsidies to gas-fired power stations to keep them on the grid, remember, they are going to get to run even less. Ed Miliband says gas-fired power stations will only be running 5% of the time in 2030. So essentially the gas-fired power stations want huge subsidies to stay on the grid, to stay available. And there are there's costs involved with only operating 5% of the time. You know, they need to protect the turbines and that sort of thing. So those costs are going to soar too. And if lest anybody not believe me, half of that increase has already been booked in contracts for 27, 28. So it's certainly not looking infeasible. Again, we're expecting those costs to go up to about £7 billion a year from about £1 billion, just over £1 billion today. So that's the bad news about Clean Power 2030. But the other thing to say about Clean Power 2030 is that it's a complete fiction. It just isn't going to happen. Ed Miliband has actually almost admitted this. He said that he really said Clean Power 2030 to make the civil servants work a bit harder at it. When it was the Conservatives' plan, it was Clean Power 2035. That was a bit more reasonable. So we're expecting it really to happen in 2035. Now, if it happens in 2035, the good thing is that this brown or tan line, the new subsidies on the new wind farms, doesn't come into play until a lot of this flesh-shaped one has faded away. So I can show you that. If I change that to 2035, okay, your peak has now dropped from over 30 down to 27. So that saves you a huge amount of money. So we're hoping and praying that Ed Miliband can't deliver it in 2030. £5 billion a year is worth having. Now, the politicians have plans here too. Our opposition parties here have said that they are going to do various things to reduce bills for customers. So the most concrete plans probably have come from the Conservatives, who are the official opposition. They've said that they are going to do away with the renewables obligation subsidies. So that's these flesh-shaped ones here. So if that happens in 2029, which is the earliest we would expect them to get into power, then you see we get a sudden drop in the cost to the consumer, although it then continues to rise because we have these new wind farms coming on stream. You can see the effect of this on bills. Okay, so the existing pipeline of wind farms produces this increase. Then we get the sudden drop when we remove the subsidies, but then the new wind farms come on stream and we're back up to where we were. So to that extent, that's not really enough to help. The other thing the Conservatives said they're going to do when they get into power is to cancel the carbon taxes on gas-fired power stations. So if that happens in 2029, yeah, there's another little boost, but it's, you know, we're still essentially looking on the right hand side. Bills are going to remain above where they are today in 2025. Okay, so it's a bit higher. So the policies that the Conservatives have announced so far are not enough to produce a reduction in bills. And the UK already has pretty much the highest electricity prices in the developed world. I think we're first for industrial prices and second for domestic prices. So this is essentially simply unsustainable. It can't go on. Certainly, yeah, the numbers we saw before would be catastrophic for the UK. So where we are with the politicians now is we're saying, yeah, like the idea of cancelling the renewables obligation, like the idea of cancelling the carbon taxes, but it's not far enough. To actually get prices down, what has to happen is we have to close down the wind farms entirely. Now, the easiest way to do this is for these new wind farms not to come on stream at all. Now, the Reform Party, who are not the official opposition, but are likely to be the next government, since they're so far ahead in the polls, they have said to wind farm developers that if they go in for the subsidy auction ahead of this, they will regret it. They're essentially threatening to rip up the contracts. Now, if they rip up the contracts, that means they don't get the subsidies. If those wind farms have been built, the wind farms will stay open because the prices they will get in the market will be high enough to cover their operating costs. They won't be profitable, but they'll be cash positive, so they won't close down. What we're hoping is that what Reform has done will be enough to have frightened off the wind farm developers completely, and they just won't go ahead. So if that happens, if AR7, the next subsidy auction, doesn't go ahead, that tan line disappears completely. And now you're in a completely different ballpark. Okay? Huge reduction in the system costs, in the overall costs. The system costs really just don't rise very much at all. And then as your subsidies fade away, it keeps falling. So what you get in terms of consumer bills is we're rising up to 2029 and then whoosh, it all goes away. Now, in reality, it would probably take you a few years to close those wind farms down. You can't just close them down because there are fears that our gas-fired power stations are so old they would actually fall apart if you tried to run them 24/7. So you'd need to fade those wind farms away. But you get the general idea. There's a huge gain to consumers to be had. And you can go the whole way. Well, look, if you're going to start ripping up contracts, let's close down all the wind farms. Okay, so let's close down all the wind farm capacity from 2029, and then you're back to really where you want to be. So these are major steps, though. As I said, the renewables obligation ones are relatively easy because there is a law that says that this scheme exists, and it says what the subsidy level is, and that can be got rid of quite easily. The CFD wind farms and solar farms have a contractual right to their subsidies, and their contracts are written in a way that basically says if you try to change anything that hurts us, we get compensation. So this is going to need primary legislation essentially to annul the contracts, and then it's going to need some change to the electricity market to force the wind farms to close. What that mechanism is, We don't really know yet. I mean, you could nationalize, you could go back to something like the single buyer market, where the grid is the sole buyer for electricity, and maybe it adds the subsidy cost onto the bids made into the market, so that something like that. Various things might cause you might be able to work it so that the wind farms just gave up the ghost and left. There's all sorts of implications beyond that. The bond markets would probably not be very happy. There's a thing called the Energy Charter Treaty. It's likely to fall foul of that. But the point is, at the end of the day, Parliament can do what it likes. If Parliament says we're going to annul the Energy Charter Treaty, it can do that. But I'm not trying to minimize how big this is. But the alternative is that we have super high electricity prices for decades. If AR7 goes ahead, those high prices are there for decades. And that would be a catastrophe. It would be unsustainable, and so it won't be sustained. Eventually, I think the UK will come round to the conclusion that we are just going to have to close the wind farms down. So I'm sort of running slightly short on time. I've got 10 minutes. Actually, no, that's okay. I think I can manage. So, yeah, I said I would talk a little bit about Ireland. A sort of a little aside here. I can probably stop sharing my screen here, actually. There we go. There's a story about the philosopher Sophocles. This was passed on by Plato. He said that when Sophocles lost his libido in old age, he described it as like being unchained from a madman. Now, I've often thought that having an interconnection to a country that's trying to decarbonize its grid is very much like being chained to a madman. And that's the situation that Ireland is in. You are chained to the UK, which is doing crazy things to its grid, and all those crazy things just come down the interconnector to you. We have the same situation with Norway has the same problem, that they have an interconnection to us, and all our craziness comes down the interconnector to them, and they are talking quite seriously about cutting the interconnector because they don't want our high prices causing pain for their consumers. There's the same situation with the French. They have very cheap nuclear electricity, but we export our high prices to them, and that they are obviously not very happy about that. In Ireland, of course, you have a slightly different situation in that your country is trying to do net zero as well. So we have a madman at both ends of the interconnector. So I guess you guys have the worst of both worlds. So yeah, not a happy situation. I think for Ireland, in terms of the interconnector, you need to pray that reform has done its work and that the next subsidy auction doesn't go ahead, because if it does, there's going to be a lot of pain coming down that interconnector to you.